us from Bristol, England. So it's what time out in Bristol right now? 8 o'clock?
No, it's five in the afternoon, 5 p.m.
5 in the afternoon, I'm sorry. Like an 8-hour difference or something, right? Yeah. So 5-hour difference, I guess.
Yeah.
So in any case, we're thrilled to have you here. Toby, do you have a copy, the cover of your book you can just quickly show us?
Here we go. This is what we're talking about today.
Wonderful, wonderful. And I really knew very little about gamification, and that's why I was interested in your book. And so tell us first a little bit about you professionally. What do you do full time?
Yep. So I'm like you. I sort of describe myself as a digital entrepreneur. So I've been working in the digital space really for all my professional career in various different guises, whether as a consultant or creating products. So my main job at the moment is I'm working with a digital publisher, and in fact, my main role for them is a marketing. So I'm a sort of the marketing, helping them market their business, both client side and supply side. So that's where I'm doing most of my actual work today.
And what made you write this book?
So really for the last 8 years, I've been working on a gamification project. So I have a software as a service tool called Rise, which I designed and built, which allows people to create their own scorecards and publish leaderboards on the web. And I've seen tens of thousands of scorecards, most of them North American, have come onto our system, and they've created these wonderful competitions for their staff or their friends. And as part of that, I've also been consulting with businesses, mainly here in the UK, but also some global and American businesses, where we've really just seen how gamification and this process of gamification can help those businesses to succeed. And so the reason I wrote the book really was to condense everything I've learned in those 8 years into something concise that another business manager would be able to pick up in an hour or two, and really kind of just be able to sort of take on from where I take over from where I left off, if you like, and in their own world.
I have to say, I never thought about, but gamification has been around almost since mankind started. And I never even thought about it in the United States, where our sports is first. I remember friends of mine have come from Europe and said, why is every TV channel on sports? And we're right now should be watching baseball, but baseball season's getting started later because of COVID. And frankly, without gamification, nobody could care about baseball, because we follow how well the hitters are hitting. The hitters follow that themselves, and they try to be better than the next guy. So they're the top rated hitter. And on every sport, there's statistics, and that's what drives everybody's interest, from the fan just watching it to the players to the gamblers. I mean, in the United States, betting on football is a multi-billion-dollar business, but it's all based on gamification, essentially. So yeah. What is gamification? What's the definition to you?
Yeah, so the key explanation of it, and I can see Matt Butler asking a question there as well, is it's game-like feedback on something real world. So gamification in a nutshell is saying, let's take the way in which you get feedback in a game like baseball or like a video game like Call of Duty or something, and that's giving you this wonderful feedback all the time on your activity and what's happening in the game world as a response to that activity. But and really what we're saying is, look, we'd really like that sort of quality of feedback in our real world activities, whether that's trying to get fitter or healthier, or whether that's trying to make our businesses succeed better. So gamification is really the process by which we do that, by which we bring game-like feedback into real world activities.
I mean, gamification started since we were little kids, right? You go to school and you get grades, right? That's kind of a gamification.
Yeah, and that's the key reason why it works so well, is that we're all conditioned. We've all had 18-20 years of conditioning from school into essentially to look at things like a score and say, how can I improve my score? So if I give you a score, you immediately, it tunes back into that kind of childhood conditioning and makes you want to improve.
So what's the difference between finite and infinite gaming?
Yeah, so the area of gamification I've been working on is called infinite gamification, and there are two types. So you can split gamification into finite and infinite, and infinite. So finite really is where there's an end. So you finish the course and you get a degree or you get a grade. You complete the task, the journey that's been set. You reach the final level, you defeat the boss, whatever it is. That's the end of the game, and that really that's where it stops, and there isn't anything else that carries on. Whereas infinite gamification is where every year, for example, it carries on. You might do well this month, but then do badly the next month, but it can carry on potentially for infinity. So something like and actually it's the infinite gamification that we actually use more in work when we have something like an employee leaderboard, or for sales performance, we have a weekly sales performance leaderboard. We're very familiar with that, and actually that's a form of infinite gamification.
So what industries and jobs benefit the most from using gamification, that it helps them raise their skill set and success?
Yeah, so for me, I think one of the things that we've learned crucial with gamification is that there isn't a kind of a one size fits all. It's a technique that is domain specific and context specific. So each industry will have a form of gamification in it, but the way in which you use gamification there will be different. So so for example, we've talked about a sales environment. There are some sales roles where it's most important to see what the revenue is. So it's what's our sales revenue. Whereas other sales roles, say, which have more of a sort of pre-sales or customer support angle, actually looking at revenue doesn't work. So you have to look at activities, or what the customer's response is, and the net promoter score, for example, as a result of it. So what we see is that each individual context will be slightly different depending on what that organization and what those players or the professionals are trying to achieve.
One of the questions was asked here is, give some examples of white hat versus black hat gamification.
Yeah, so I mean, really it's the key here is that I can give you a score that sends you off to do a particular behavior, but it's only because I'm manipulating you. So I'm saying, if you do this, you'll get a particular score. So for me, that's what black hat gamification is about. It's any form of sort of deception that you're using to try and encourage certain behaviors. Whereas the white hat gamification that I'm more, which is much more sustainable and actually works long term, is where individuals are actually engaged in what is the score, how do I improve it, but also then how do I improve the algorithm that goes into the score. So it's much more of a collaborative process.
Why is adoption and performance important?
So in one of the models that I talk about in the book, we talk about, when we look at the metrics that we give our team or we give ourselves, actually you can put them onto a 4x4 matrix. And so some of those metrics will help us to learn. So for example, let's take learning social media, which is something a lot of businesses have been involved in over the last 5 or 6 years. So a learning metric might be, have you created your Twitter account? That would be a basic yes or no learning metric, and it's a kind of a sort of it's a black or white solution. You've either done it or you haven't. An adoption and performance is then saying, well, okay, it's one thing to create a Twitter account, but are you actually tweeting? Has anybody replied? Has anybody had a conversation with you? So the adoption and performance is saying, okay, you may have learned how to do this thing, but are you actually doing it in your day job, and are you doing it well? So that's where for me, infinite gamification comes in, because it provides a way of giving us scores and feedback around those two sort of more developed parts of a process.
How do companies currently use gamification, and can they use it to improve performance? And I think you gave examples in the sales side, but how do you use it on the non-sales side? Because that seems like pretty much the layup, right?
Yeah, so that's right. So one of the things that we've seen is around, where it's very popular, is around take up of particular workflows or so processes and tools. So for example, we talked about that Twitter example. So if I give a real example of that, so PricewaterhouseCoopers have created an infinite gamification program where any of their staff can sign up with their Twitter account to see how they're doing in terms of creating a successful Twitter presence vis-a-vis the rest of the staff at PricewaterhouseCoopers, so PwC. So that's been a good one. The other one, which I talk about in the book, is where we've tried it with some electrical faults engineers, where the objective there was not, and this is why gamification is very interesting, because it's very different every context, and so you can't just sort of take something and say, oh, that would work here. But if I give you the example, you'll get a flavor for it. So they weren't so worried about the faults engineers doing the job. You know, most people going to fix a electrical fault, they're going to generally do it safely, because otherwise they die. They're generally going to do a good job, because otherwise the whole thing explodes and blows up. So actually the sorts of metrics that they were gamifying were the things they just needed to smooth or improve. So are they entering the time they arrived at the site into the computer system, so that the feedback back to the rest of the management was right? Are they getting through the traffic to get to the fault in time? And so actually their scoring system that they came up with wasn't that related to the job itself, but it was related to the other behaviors around the job that the management felt were important, and that the engineers themselves also wanted to optimize.
How can government leaders use it for positive change? Because I kind of think that we only hear about numbers when they're running for election, and that's how they kind of gamify their existence. But I'm wondering, how can the government use gamification to get all aspects of government to be more successful, and maybe even compensate them for that?
Yeah, that is a good question. So, I mean, governments are all different. So different governments have different current requirements. I mean, I work with the guys in Sierra Leone, the Ministry of Justice. The objective there was to get the caseload moving swiftly through the justice. So we're working with the Chief Justice, and he wanted to get the casework not to get stuck, because one of the problems with justice in a place like Sierra Leone is actually lots of cases can just kind of pile up, and no one gets it. No one can see where they're all stuck. So actually the gamification there was really about giving a score for how quickly they were getting the cases to move through the system, because that was the problem. So that's an example where governments can sort of, a very specific place, can say, okay, well, actually, if we're giving a score back to the judges themselves, and they're suddenly being told, actually, you know what, it is important how quickly you're moving cases through, then that is effectively gamifying them. And it's obviously in their interest, because they want to see justice done in Sierra Leone. So that's an example of sort of at a micro level where a government has used it. In terms of the macro level, obviously, as you mentioned, running for office, the process of getting elected is a gamification process. There's a winner, and there's votes and things. But I think another area where governments can take a page or two out of take a page or two out of my book, I guess, but yeah, take a page or two out of the gamification playbook is where you say, okay, if I'm gonna give you guys a score, whether that's all my schools in my district, or whether that's all the hospitals in my area, or the refuse collectors, or whatever, is to actually blend the scores together, blend the metrics together, so that you're not just sort of narrowing their focus on a single metric, but by blending them, you can actually get a better result. So and as an example of an organization doing this, the United Nations Development Program, they were concerned that most governments were looking solely at GDP as a measure of success. So if if our country has the highest gross domestic product, we must be the best country. And they're saying, well, that's not strictly true, because you can be a country like Saudi Arabia, which has lots of oil wealth, but actually you're not looking after your mothers who are dying in childbirth much more than neighboring countries, or your children aren't being educated long enough. So they created this thing called the Human Development Index, which blended those metrics together. And so then the score and the ranking that came out of it was reflective of those priorities. So that's another way in which governments can start to use gamification to create a better score, I think is the best way of putting it, that actually leads to the behaviors that the government wants.
And we need them to have better behaviors. How about ongoing training? How does gamification help ongoing training?
Yeah, so what do you mean? So ongoing training, so I mean, we all need to keep training. So, I mean, a good example of that, we already have continuous professional development points. So a lot of membership organizations have CPD points. And that's an example of incentivizing or enforcing a gamification, a mechanism to make sure people keep training, whether they're a doctor or a professional or whatever. So I think gamification would look, with a gamification lens on that, you'd say that's great, CPD points are good. What are the other kind of micro behaviors that also are part of that? So it might be not just about attending the courses, it might be about watching the right YouTube videos or the TEDx's, or commenting on particular papers that are being written, that are contributing to peer papers. So there may be other micro behaviors that can also be blended into a way of giving those professionals better feedback, and so they're kind of more incentivized to continue their ongoing training.
Is it recommended to have a carrot at the end of the stick when trying to gamify activity for employees? If you were one of the top people in whatever category, you might win something?
So this is very context dependent. So I know that in North America, virtually every program has a carrot at the end of the stick. So, but that's not the case, say, in other cultures. So it really depends on your culture. The one thing I've observed though is that once you put the carrot on the end of the stick, it's a bit like walking into a room with a bright light, and everybody goes and they look at the carrot and they think, I'm going to move my behavior because that bright light is what I want. Whereas actually gamification is sometimes about having subdued lighting, and it's you walk into the room and you might not get anything physical or extrinsic as a result of it, but this will help you to do better yourself. For me, I've seen the best programs are where the feedback is the reward, good quality feedback that helps me get better, rather than say a carrot. So if you look at the success of something like Fitbit, we will use a Fitbit, and we'll try and get our 10,000 steps a day, but there's no carrot that we get other than the intrinsic benefit of getting fitter.
That's true. That's very true. And yet there's like, I have one where there's balloons going off and fireworks to say you've reached your number, and you kind of feel good about that, or losing weight. Carrot or stick, are there situations where gamification resulting in a negative or a punishment is preferable to one structured to result in a positive or a reward?
So the short answer to that is yes, of course there are, because there are some cultures in which you don't want to have, if you make some sort of mistake, it's critical. It's a question of and one of the things that I always encourage people with gamification is again coming back to it's your context. These in the book are a set of tools and processes for you to design a program that fits for your context. It's not about saying this is how it will work, but yes, there are. I've seen I'm trying to think of the one that springs to mind in answer to that question is a very old example, but I saw on the board at an old English country manor, there was the servants. You had all the list of the servants' fines for if they were late to dinner or didn't bring the chicken to the right place or whatever it was. So we do have that. I mean, if you take footballers, professional footballers or professional soccer players, there are fines for them for poor behaviour on and off the pitch. So of course there are examples where you need to have the stick to work.
I have to say that without metrics, nobody cares about anything. I mean, if you look in, especially in sports, if players went out and just played the game and there wasn't all these numbers, it would be hard to differentiate between one great player and another. And none of these guys could make a lot of money as pitching people for different products. I mean, you wouldn't even know who Tiger Woods was. Yes, he won the tournament, and you could say a number of tournaments, but then if you don't have all the numbers that correspond, or basketball, so many points, that type of thing is what people follow and buy the shirts and everything else for. Is developing metrics for almost everything considered gamification?
So any metrics where you're giving the metric to the participant and saying, this is your score, is gamification, because any participant will look at the score and say, how do I make that a better score? How do I optimize it? So in any scenario, so the only scenario which isn't metric scenario is when you're keeping your own kind of stats, say you're a manager or you're looking at marketing stats or whatever, and you're not giving those stats out to the person who's doing, the participant. That's not really gamification. That's business insight. That's analytics. But gamification is where I give you your score and and I expect that to change your behavior. So a government that gives the league table for schools, which they do in this country a lot, that's classic gamification.
How do you get to the critical few measurements instead of measuring a lot of things that are not really of value?
So often the problem is that you can't count everything that you want. So I mean, Einstein said it very well. He said, not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that can be counted counts. You can't necessarily get it. So all gamification at some level is a model of real world. The question really is, what are the metrics that help me a little bit more than I'm doing it today? It's in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. Can I get a little bit more insight that will help me a little bit better? My Fitbit doesn't solve my fitness problem, but it does help me see daily how active I am at a rough level.
By the way, everybody should get your book. It's a very easy read and gave me great insight to a lot of different areas that you don't even think about. And we're going to talk about some of those areas. What are most gamification based on?
So mostly it's on quantitative data. So it's anything that can be quantified. And I think one of the reasons that gamification is more relevant today is that there is a lot of data around. The increasing digitization of our lives, of our work, of tools, there's sensors everywhere. That is leading to, frankly, more scores. And so I suppose the reason I've written this book today and in this time is because I would like there to be those scores to be good scores. I want them to be well-designed scores. I want them to have a good impact on us as the people who are given the scores. And the danger is that we just get all of this digitization and we get some rotten scores which lead us doing all sorts of unwanted behaviors.
When can gamification be dangerous?
Yes. So for example, there's lots of examples of dangerous gamification. I mean, an obvious one might be if I was running a competition. So, and this is a real thing. So the Guinness Book of Records, they have a category for who can hold their breath underwater for the longest. Now, that's a very dangerous way of gamification because there's going to be a lot of people trying to break that record. And there's going to be lots of people who go, and there are, who try to hold their breath for too long and die as a result. So that's an example of dangerous gamification because in the sense that I've set a target and I've set a feedback system that actually people are trying too hard to beat. In a more kind of bit more sort of business context, the classic example I would use would be the Wells Fargo incident where Wells Fargo suddenly saw millions of fraudulent accounts being created for their customers because their sales staff were looking at the wrong were being incentivized wrongly to try and increase the number of new accounts they opened.
How can gamification actually hurt somebody? We just talked about dangerous and it could be drinking games and so forth, but how can it be dangerous from a psychological standpoint?
Yeah, so there's an element of gamification, and back to your question of talking about white hat and black hat gamification. I don't know where I'd put it. There's a concept in gambling called a variable ratio reward, and there's a lot of psychological work done on it. The main person was Skinner, but there's lots of different ones. And essentially, a slot machine works as a variable ratio reward. The reason we like playing slot machines is not because I pull the handle 20 times and I get $2. It's because I pull the handle 20 times and sometimes I get $50 and sometimes I get nothing. And that is that creates the addictive behavior, that variable ratio reward. I don't know how often I'm going to get the reward and how much it's going to be. So if I create my gamification system with that variable ratio reward in the mix, then I'm actually creating something that looks like gambling, and of course can create an addictive behavior, which has all sorts of bad side effects, particularly for the individual.
My mom loves slot machines. I'm thinking of burying her with one of them when she goes. She does. She loves it. How does the psychology of how different sexes think play into gamification?
I don't know. So I'm afraid I'm going to have to pass on that one. I don't know the research on that, on the different sexes. My understanding is it's not that different. But I don't know any differences, any gender differences in gamification at the moment.
So we'd have to find somebody who studied that. I know I taught 10 years at Wharton, and there was actually somebody who studied that and wrote papers on that, but I don't know the answer to that myself. What, in your book, you write, what's the process for developing a meaningful gamification program? And you talk about the process.
Yes. So if you think of your process, I break it into 3 steps. There's always 3 steps, but it's in analysis, design, and then evolution. And so analysis is what you and your listeners will be familiar with, is really just looking at what's there, what are you trying to achieve, and what's there currently. I think it's the second part of it that people kind of often forget to check, is that we're all being scored an awful lot as it is. So if I'm introducing for example, I think I talk about in the book, a developer score for software programmers. Software programmers have lots of scores that they get sort of whether they're doing well on something like Stack Overflow, or whether their code gets a good review. So when you're introducing a new score, you need to be thinking, okay, you need to be saying, okay, when I introduce this score to hopefully direct signpost the right behaviors for you, what's the context in which that score is arriving into your life? So that's the kind of so that analysis phase really goes into what am I trying to achieve, where am I going to get the data from, and how will my players react to it. And then the design phase is, in the book, we go through, it's really the way I would think of it is a checklist of different sort of things to think about. And the thing is, there are different metrics that you can use in your design. There are different ways you can structure if you want to include a competitive element. There are different ways you can structure it. There are different ways you can structure how people join the program. But the key with the design, again, is as long as you've done a good analysis phase, you're probably going to get the design right, because you're going to know what your players want and what you're trying to achieve. And so you design something that fits that. And then the third phase, the evolution, is the one that most business leaders, and I think this is probably the thing that's freshest in the book, that I don't think that is common knowledge, if you like, is that most people create a gamification system and they think that's it. Oomph, this is my system, that you get scores for this, and I'll push it out and let it be done. But actually, the best programs, and you look at the ones that have lasted, they're the ones that started relatively simple and actually changed over time. So and even the games which we think of as fixed, something like international rugby, for example, the rules of rugby have changed 8 times, completely changed in eight times over the last 100 or so years. And we don't realize that, but actually they've been tweaked over time. And so that evolution phase is also very important to say, actually, my end goal is my original objective. It doesn't really matter what the metrics are and the incentives and all that. All of that can change as long as I bring my players with me. I tell them, I communicate the change in advance, and actually we evolve it together to make it an effective scoring system that actually helps us all get better.
What is meant by prime directive that you write about in the book?
Yes, so I use the term prime directive. The main reason is to say that one of the things that we get wrong when we design scoring systems or infinite gamification programs is we often try and put too much into one program. We try and solve marketing's problems, sales problems, my domestic problems, all in some single system. And actually, you don't need to do it. It's very cheap to give someone a score relatively, you know, or a leaderboard and a score. It's a very cheap thing to do. So actually, it's better just for each program to have its own directive. It's one thing that it's trying to do, and then have another one. You could roll it out alongside it that's trying to do something else. You might have one program for this system and another one for that system. There's nothing wrong with that. So really the idea of the prime directive is to say, who's really pushing for this program? What is the one thing we want to achieve with it?
Well, what's meant by a formal score? Why formal? What's meant by that?
Yeah, so a lot of if you take something like HR within organizations, HR do a lot of formal scores. They might you know, an obvious formal score is what salary someone gets. That's a very formal score. It's very specific. It's contracted in. It's there's even regulation around it. Another one might be another type of formal score might be your sales. Someone who joins the sales team will know what their commission is going to be and their target will be. So those are very formal skills. They're pretty much set in stone. They're very much written down, and they're part of my kind of remuneration and contracts. I might face termination if I don't hit my score. So those are the formal scores. The informal scores are things that are kind of they have less wrapped around them, if you like. They are you know, how many phone calls am I making this month? Am I doing well on the sort of the general leaderboard? Am I doing well on my social media? Is my LinkedIn doing well? Those are they're also scores, but they're just they're much less formal. They haven't been set in stone and made part of the core business process. And one of the things I would say is that you do see scores move generally along that sort of spectrum over time. So something that starts off very informal may in time become quite formalized. So for example, like CIPD points in membership organizations, but it's a scale, it's a sliding scale.
You're saying continuing education points? Is that what you meant?
Yes, continuing education points. So what I'm thinking that some member organizations might have started off by saying, let's try and encourage people to do more education. And then over time, they might say, well, actually, if someone isn't doing enough education, then they shouldn't be part of this organization and we'll terminate their membership. So that's a score that might have started quite informally, but has become very formal and is really part of the way in which that organization is structured.
For sure. What's the best way to use gamification to improve performance, whether it's gaming ourselves or people that are working for us, especially in these, as companies become really successful, not in the early stages, because everybody's incented to just get to profitability. But when you run a big organization, and that's why the Fortune 500 has changed so much from the beginning. I think there's only 2 or 3 companies from the original Fortune 500 that even exist anymore. So how do you go and do that you're going to keep getting increased improvement by individuals and the organization as a whole?
So I think the one thing, if I was a Fortune 500 CEO, I would make sure I had just like I might hire a kind of a chief marketing officer, I would have for want of a better word, a chief continuous performance officer, somebody whose job it was to make sure, was not so much make sure that my metrics for the CEO's metrics were being achieved, like the objectives, key results, and all of that, and all the share performance. I think that's part of the existing systems, but more to say, how do I make sure that every part of my organization is looking at how do we improve performance in a managed way. So and that would be saying, okay, each department should have its own gamification programs and multiple ones, but it would be the overall objective is to say, how do we make sure that we never stay still, we're always improving everywhere we are.
You know, maybe that's what HR should be, because so often companies use HR as just handling benefits and firing people, but
Yes.
maybe a good way to leverage HR should be worrying about continuous performance of everybody in the organization, and how do we get that from them.
Yeah, and I think you're
Yeah.
absolutely right. And the one thing I would say is that in order for that to happen, I think that HR needs to let go of purely formal scores as its remit. Is that the point of that continuous performance obviously is to say it's okay for the business to be having informal scores that don't directly result in someone being terminated or receiving a bonus. It's okay to have scores and programs in place which are help individuals perform better.
And that could get their overall score up anyway for whatever you've tasked them for. Yeah. When designing a program, what are the 5 potential roles? You talk about that in the book.
Yeah, so in the book we talk. So imagine you've got your set of participants in your program, and you need to think, how am I going to relate to them? What is the role in which I'm taking here? And there are 5 roles that I've identified as kind of the different ones, and I think in lots of situations I think I've played all the different ones. So the one we most often think about is the manager role. It's I am responsible for the organization's goals, and I'm trying to corral you as my reports towards achieving those goals. So that's kind of the manager's approach to gamification. They're saying these metrics are important to you, but because they're important to us as an organization. The second type of role is someone who works more like a coach. So the coach's job is not necessarily concerned with how the organization improves, but how the individuals improve. So if you think about your personal fitness instructor, they have a sort of coach mindset. They'll be saying, right, Mark, how have you done 20 burpees this month or 20 sit-ups? Well done, you did 20 more than last month. That the coach is not trying to improve the organization, they're trying to improve the individuals through gamifying them. A commentator is somebody who sits outside both the organization and the individual. So we talk about Forbes. So when Forbes creates its Forbes 500 or its Forbes 400 list of rich people, it's acting as a commentator. It's saying, these are the participants in the gamification, the game, if you like, and this is how they're doing. And the reason that they do that is because they know that there's a wider audience who are interested in that information. And then the last 2 are kind of variants on a theme. There's a referee type, which is really doesn't have any skin in the game. They're completely disinterested, and they've been asked to maintain the program on behalf of the others. So we see that in things like circulation numbers for newspapers. There are kind of referee type organizations that, like ABC, that their job is just to make sure that the numbers are correct, they're audited, or the national statistics bodies, they tend to be referee type mindsets. And then the final type, this player coach, is somebody who says, well, if I challenge you all to a Fitbit challenge, and I say, okay guys, let's see who can improve the number of steps this week by 10%, that would be me acting as a player coach, because I'm going to be doing it for myself too, but I'm also encouraging everybody else in my everybody, all you guys, to try and do it too.
Toby, I have to admire, you didn't take the easy way out of that question by just using sports examples.
Yes, sorry.
No, you use great quality business examples of which is what everybody needs to hear. What is a player needs analysis, and how can businesses use it?
Yeah, so we're all very familiar with kind of organization-centered design for our management. So what does the organization need to happen for it to succeed? Something like an OKR type approach, it doesn't really matter, or just saying these are our KPIs. We, as managers, we're very familiar with that. Player-centered design, or it starts with player needs analysis, and it's looking at it's looking at it from the point of the person receiving the score, receiving the ranking, and saying, how are they going to, what direction do I want them to go in as a result? So again, let's take our sales reps as an example. So the organization might only really care about sales revenue. It doesn't actually care how that comes about. But a sales manager might say, well, hang on, I need to design a program that signposts to my reps the behaviors that will help them get that sales revenue. So making a prospect list, making calls, and so on. So there's that difference really there. So player needs analysis is where you start saying, okay, how can I help my participants? What do they need to get better? What feedback do they need to get better at what they're trying to achieve?
You right here, please talk about player personas and how that figures into developing the right games for performance improvement.
Mm. So, people respond to these sorts of programs in lots of different ways, different because of their conditioning, what their experience in the past. So player personas is really about saying, okay, if I break down my the group of people who I'm providing this program for, and actually thinking, okay, getting inside their head and thinking it from their point of view. So a persona is a way of kind of categorizing your group. And an example might be that you might say, okay, we've got, for our one program, we might have old hands and new hands. So actually they're going to look at this scoring system in a different way. The old hands are going to be like, will be coming at it just with less of a kind of how can I maintain my existing status and performance, whereas the new hands will be looking at it saying, how can I get better at something an activity I'm just starting to get good at. So player personas help us to say, okay, let's break down our audience, the player audience, into different kind of groups.
How can gamification help you select the right people for the right roles at the right stage of the company?
Yeah, I mean, I sort of almost want to send this question back to you. How would you do it? I mean, the only thing the useful thing I've sort of is kind of really anecdotal, really, is I've seen that some of the people, the sorts of staff that look at their gamification and are interested in improving, are also the ones that you kind of want to, you probably as an organization want to promote, because anybody who's optimizing for themselves is likely to optimize for others and for if they're put in charge of something more. So that would be kind of how I would answer that question.
Yeah, I think that's right. I would probably go along with the same thing that you said. What is and what are the best incentives? Like, that really money is the best incentive? You know, what are the incentives that really work best with people, or does it depend on the job? What do you do?
Yeah, it depends on the job. I mean, you've got in the book, you've got the different types. You've got sort of status, so, getting better at something, access to things, power over others, stuff, cash. There are different ways in which you can incentivize people externally. I mean, at the end of the day, if you want a program that's going to continue infinitely, then the intrinsic incentives are the best ones, the ones that people want to do themselves: get fit, lose weight, have more friends, do well at their job. Any program that helps people to do better at something they already want to do is going to succeed long term.
What is wrong with mandatory programs?
Yeah, so and this comes to this kind of this problem with informal and formal scores and how people look at it, is that if you enforce a program on your participants, what you're saying is you're really kind of saying, this is what I think is important, and you've got to do it. It's a very kind of not coercive, but it's a very managerial approach to this. Whereas actually some of the better programs are where you say, listen, I want to help you get better at your job. I want to help you by giving you good feedback. If you opt into this program, then you're going to get that feedback. And so that opt-in gets you buy-in. They will then, those players, they're not going to say, oh, this is Toby or this is Mark's program. To hell with it. It doesn't matter that I'm doing badly. They're going to say, actually, this is my program and I want to get better at it. So, I mean, a classic example of that might be something like Weight Watchers, where you have to pay to lose weight. But by getting that, by the participants paying, they're getting a much more buy-in than if, say, the state was saying you must attend this weight watching program.
How can one convince a manager as to the benefits of gamification when they believe it's an employee's responsibility to do the best they can? Said another way, the company pays the employee to perform their job and do it well. Anything else, such as gamification, should not be necessary. But it is. I mean, at the end of the day, people still need some kind of motivation, and they're only motivated so far in their own self-interest or to get better. So how do you answer that?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's right. And I mean, in some jobs, there isn't a need for gamification, of course. I think that there are, if you think about it again from the employee's point of view, though, we all like feedback. We all like to get to know when if we're doing a good job or we're doing a bad job. So gamification kind of sits in that gap between kind of your annual performance review and just sort of just doing the work itself. It's signposting the right behaviors, and it might be some new behaviors. It might be trying to help people with old behaviors. Again, it depends on context. And so I think the benefit of gamification is that it helps. It just gives me, again, like that land of the blind, a one-eyed man is king. It just gives me a little bit more visibility of what the right activities and behaviors are to make sure that I do the job that I'm being paid to do.
Makes me think that we should, as a society, gamify the leader's role in any country and have them want to succeed in a certain way. A certain percentage of people end up graduating high school, then college, and a certain amount of jobs are retained. There should be something, and they're compared from their past presidents or prime ministers, and that's how we keep score for them, and see how they do. Talk about the value of leagues, and esports is really the king of this. About the concept of leagues, because there's all types of leagues in esports, and that's like the biggest gamification. It's global. But what's the value of leagues even in business?
So in business, the main value is to give people some extra information on how they're doing. So the key thing that I've learned really is that the thing that comes first in a infinite gamification is the score. It's how are you doing is much more important than how are you doing vis-a-vis other people. It's also interesting, but it shouldn't be ideally it's not the thing that you see first. The thing you see first is, hey, you're doing a good job, or hey, I did better this week than last week, or hey, I did worse this week than last week. That's the most important thing. The leagues then have their place in helping people to see how I'm doing versus the people I see as my peers. And that's where the interesting piece comes in, is that one of the things that people often get wrong is they make a great big league with everybody on it, and you've got 500 people there. And so the top 10%, the top 50 people are sort of interested in how they're jostling for position. The other 450 are like, well, I don't really mind. I'm never going to do well. So actually with leagues, it's important to design them as well and say, okay, well, how can I make it more engaging? And a classic way to do it is to break down that 500 league into maybe 10 smaller leagues by geo or region or by function or whatever it is, of 50 people in each. And then you're going to get more people are going to be who will be able to see themselves jostling for position with people who are like them, with peers like them.
I find interesting in social media that they've so gamified that Facebook has had to make adjustments because people would feel bad. You post a picture, I have an English bulldog, and I post a picture of that, and I get like 85 likes, and I'm trying to game that to get as many likes as possible. And then you mentioned something else that you thought was really interesting, and two people thought that was interesting, and now you feel bad about yourself, and you go to the local bar and drink your day away because you only got those 2 likes. So how has social platforms really impacted and how they use gamification to keep people, on those platforms for hours and hours? What's the average that people spend 5 hours a day on these platforms or more?
Yeah, no, it's crazy. And they're a good example of how the score, we're getting these new scores that we didn't have 10, 20 years ago because of the digitization of, in this case, social communication has now led to these scores. Now, the conversation I'd want us to be having is exactly what you say. I mean, why we 2 billion people are all blindly accepting the score that has been given to us by Facebook as to whether our content is valuable or not. Now, arguably we should have some controls over it, and maybe we have different scores for different countries, or you have a different way of talking about it. But there's lots of conversations we had. But the key point is that we need to be aware that we've been given a score and think, is that a good score or a bad score? Is that score helping me in the direction that I want to go, or is it actually just helping Facebook in the direction that they want to go? I don't have the answer to it, but the key is the first step is to recognize that you're being gamified. Yes.
I mean, it's funny. I wrote this piece about my father for Father's Day, and as I saw the numbers going up, I found that I was paying more attention to it throughout the day. and to see how I was doing. But I could see where people put a picture of something, you know, maybe it's their daughter going to the prom, and if the daughter doesn't get a lot of likes, then they feel like bad, and then the daughter feels inadequate. So, yeah.
Well, the classic one, if you come across streaks on Snapchat, have you come across that one where, the way that they've done it is that if the two people talking to each other on Snapchat, they have to send each other a message every day in order to maintain the streak. So if we and I were chatting every day, we get another day on a streak. And then you have people losing friends because someone forgot to do a Snapchat and destroys the streak. And so actually it can become a genuine sort of argument between people.
That explains why I used to have 5 kids and now I only have 2. So what's the most common pitfalls and mistakes made when people are developing games that they think are going to improve the performance of people?
Yeah, I think we mentioned some of them earlier, didn't we? I mean, the main thing I see is people being too complicated to begin with. It's amazing what a spreadsheet will do to a manager once they get stuck into trying to create their gamification program. So we look at other gamification programs and like your baseball statistics, for example, and we see the end of the evolution process. We see a very mature score, and we think when we create something, we've got to create a mature score, but that's not true. When we create things, it starts nice and simple, you know, who makes the most tea, or just keep it very sort of 1 or 2 metrics. So that's one of the common pitfalls. And the other one is getting the incentives wrong. We're talking about this carrot and stick, and I have to reiterate, it is difficult, and I don't know the answer for each context. But I think that a lot of managers tend to just throw a big incentive at it, and then is trying to shortcut the whole kind of evolution process of finding the right feedback. Because as soon as you put a big reward in it, no one's going to contest whether those are the right metrics or not. They'll just do everything they can to do the best on those metrics. So the two things, starting too complex and incentivizing too much too early, I think are the most common pitfalls.
Can the data ever help identify hurdles that get in the way of an employee improving their scores?
Yes, so there's that's a whole area that you can use as well. Yeah, so you are going to get data on employees that if you use it in the right way, as part of the program. I'm trying to think of a good example. So with our faults engineer program, actually, one of the guys who they knew was a good employee and was doing a really good job had this terrible score, and they were looking at it and thinking, well, what on earth is going on here? And actually, when they looked, so that was kind of almost the canary in the gold mine that triggered the managers to then go and look at how that employee was using the system. And it ended up as really simple. He wasn't closing his faults properly on the computer system. He wasn't closing them, so they looked like they were never finished. So that's an example where because you're gamifying the data, the quality of the data gets so much better.
I have 2 final questions for you here. How do you stop people from gaming the system?
Yeah, so gaming the system is gaming the system. I think of as when people find a cheap way to win that isn't what you wanted them to do. That's how you think of it. But the kind of the cloak is the quote to sort of bear in mind. And again, it's in the book. Don't blame the gamer, blame the game. So if people are gaming the system, it means that you need to change the game. And it might be that there's some cheap ways to gain points that shouldn't be there. And so you can, again, if as long as you've got this mindset and narrative around, we're going to evolve, we're going to update the score, then you've got the flexibility to change it and to move it away from those gaming behaviors, which are damaging and not what you want.
Last question for you. What is the future of gamification and how do you see it changing?
Yeah, well, I like your point about this being part of HR and this being an upskilling of the whole HR role. I think gamification in that sense would be great. I think it's a skill that any business manager, any business leader should have. We should all be taught it at business school or wherever, that those sort of some of the basics around infinite gamification. You know, how do I get what is a well-designed program, what is a badly designed program, what can happen when I sort of signpost the right scores and or the wrong scores. And so for me, it's the twofold. It's one, it's a skill that each of us need as leaders, but also secondly, it's something that organizations adopt at a quite a corporate, an HR type level, but as something that we talked about, sort of trying, not so much top down, this is how we want to measure you, but more, we want everybody within the organization to try and continuously improve.
Toby, I can't tell you how much I appreciate you talking to us from England today. I loved your energy, and you were great at answering the questions. Everybody got a lot out of it, and it's a topic that we've been reading more and more about, and we're going to continue to hear more about. So I hope you sell a lot of books. I hope some of the folks here buy your book, and let us know when you write the next book.
Great. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Enjoy the rest of your weekend. Take care, and thanks again.
Cheers. Thank you. Bye-bye.